All right. Hello again, Avengers, and welcome to another exciting in-depth review. Quick reminder, if you do enjoy this stuff, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon to turn notifications on. All those things are super, super important. Now, we are going to be taking a trip into the Shattered Grid. That's right. Today, I'm doing an in-depth review of Power Rangers role-playing game Through the Shattered Grid sourcebook. Sorry, needed to drink something. A quick reminder, my in-depth reviews are exactly that. They are in-depth. I go chapter by chapter, sometimes page by page. I talk about the things that I like. I talk about the things that I don't like. Talk about the things that they did well. I talk about the things they need to do better. But a lot of people don't want to sit through an hour and a half or 2 hour long video just to figure out if they want to purchase something. So I always have a section in the beginning called Should I Buy This? And I separate potential buyers into 3 separate groups. The first group is players. These are people that are primarily, not exclusively, but primarily going to be sitting at a table and playing a single player character. The second group is game masters. These are people that are primarily, not exclusively, but primarily going to be sitting at a table and playing the role of the game master or dungeon master or whatever system it is we're reviewing. And obviously they have different wants and needs than a player is going to have. The third group is a group that I call the Lorehounds. They are often overlooked by a lot of manufacturers and game designers, but they are a very essential part of the makeup of people that buy RPG books. Lorehounds may never actually sit down and play a single game of that particular RPG system, but they really enjoy the lore, the stories behind them, and obviously they have very, very different needs than either players or GMs. So, should you buy this? Well, let's find out. The first group. Should players buy this? So, when I am kind of classifying source books, there's a bunch of different kind of ways that you can build source books and kind of expansions and things to a tabletop RPG. You have what are called core books. Core books are exactly that. They contain the rules for the game, and no matter what else you're doing, you're probably going to have to buy the core book. Then you just have like generic rules expansions, which will introduce new player options, new GM options, things like that. They still require the core book, but there's no sort of theme around them, or if they do have a theme, it's generally tied primarily to the new options that are being introduced. The final type of rules expansion type thing is what I call campaign settings. And these are primarily meant to kind of create a new world for you to play in. And a lot of times they will have new player options. They will have new options for the GM. But the primary purpose of them is to set up this new setting. And Through the Shattered Grid is, for lack of a better term, Through the Shattered Grid is a campaign setting. Campaign settings generally tend to favor GMs more than players. But this one is kind of unique. First things first, just because of how the Essence 20 system works. There's a bunch of new player options in here. When I do the in-depth review, I will talk about how I'm not particularly fond of how they introduce the players options, because it's a little bit more confusing than I think it needs to be. I understand why they did it. I just don't think it was a great decision. But they introduce a bunch of new player options. And some of those are new roles. They have 2 new roles. They have the Magna Defender role and they have the Eltarian Guardian role. Both of those roles, even compared to the other new Power Rangers roles that they've introduced, like the Gold Ranger and the Silver Ranger and all that stuff, and even like the Aqua Ranger and those kind of alternate color Rangers, the Magna Defender and especially the Eltarian Guardian are massively different gameplay-wise. They play very, very different anything. So that in and of itself, very useful if you wanted to use those roles. But generally, the only time you're going to be using those roles is either if you're building a new character, or you decide to take the Spectrum Shift perk. And the Eltarian Guardian is not something I think that would ever make sense for you to Spectrum Shift into, just because of how it works lore-wise and everything like that. So if the only thing this book had was these new roles, maybe it's not the greatest thing in the world. There's also some new influences and some new origins, which are also really, really interesting. They are heavily tied to the Shattered Grid kind of storyline. And so there's a few aspects of them that if your campaign is not set somehow related to the Shattered Grid, your abilities are going to be useless. Like one of, I think it's an influence or an origin, I can't remember which, gives you basically extra abilities and kind of buffs when you're dealing with people that are not from your reality. Well, if your campaign's not using alternate realities or using kind of the premise of the Shattered Grid, then you're kind of screwed. And there's really no use for it. So that stuff, in it all, it's cool, but it's really only good if you're starting a new character. They add a ton of new grid powers, regular general perks, and a bunch of new Zord perks. So even if you're not building a brand new character, you have a Power Rangers campaign that you're already running, there's still a remarkable amount of stuff in here that you can use, including probably one of my favorite things that they've added. They've basically added an upgrade to weapons that turns them into modular weapons, or transforming weapons. Kind of akin to how the Power Axe turned into the Power Cannon, and that was really it. We really don't have these kind of modular weapons really very often in Power Rangers until you get to Hyperforce, where literally every one of their weapons had two different forms. And spoiler alert, Hyperforce shows up in here. I'm very, very happy about that. I watched Hyperforce live. I cheered them on. I kind of got to know Peter and Yoshi Sadarsu through it. Not that I think either of them would remember me now, but we interacted a little bit. I even gave Yoshi a Pokemon when he was doing his Scarlet and whatever the other one was. The newest Pokemon game, I actually gave him a Pokemon. So he has one of my Pokemons. So anyway. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff here mechanics-wise for players. In addition to that, this whole book is just full of lore from the comic books. And it's actually kind of impressive. So the Shattered Grid in and of itself, as far as the comic books are concerned, the Shattered Grid basically took up the first, I don't know, maybe like half of the original Boom Studios run. When you deal with the Shattered Grid stuff and then all the stuff that happened as a direct result of it, you were done by, about issue like 50, 55 are in there. It's not that it was never referenced ever again. Drakon comes back constantly, but the actual Shattered Grid stuff, it was a huge plot point for the first part of the Power Rangers comics, and then they went on to other things. So I kind of thought that's what this book is going to be, and it's not. It deals with the Shattered Grid, but it also deals with basically every major comic plot point all the way to the end of the first Boom Studios run. So from that standpoint, there's a lot of lore in here that you can use to kind of make more interesting characters, including a few origins and influences that basically allow you to play a Shattered Grid character effectively in a non-Shattered Grid world. And what I mean by that is there's a few origins and influences that are basically, you're not from this reality. Either it's explicitly stated in there or kind of loosely implied which I think creates a really interesting dynamic and can actually be used later on by your game master to kind of expand the world. Something that a lot of game masters have an issue with is the idea of kind of the tiers of play in D&D, where tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4. The reason that they're put into those designations is twofold. One, power levels. When you go from tier 1 to tier 2, it is a massive, massive change. You get access to third level spells. It changes everything. Tier 2 to tier 3, same thing. Tier 3 to tier 4, same thing. But at the same time, your characters that you're playing also have a massive change. When you're a tier 1 character, you basically are kind of saving a single town. Like, they might know about you in that town, but that's it. When you get to tier 2, you start being kind of the heroes that, you know, are able to save an entire area, maybe a city state or something like that. Tier 3, you start dealing with kind of world problems and international style issues. And by the time you get to tier 4, you are saving the entirety of the world, if not the universe, existence in and of itself. And kind of the same thing is true of most tabletop RPGs, where your characters will start very tiny focused and get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And we see it in Power Rangers all the time. They start off with stuff that's really just focused on, I'm going to protect myself, I'm going to protect my friends, I'm going to protect my school. And it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger till, oh wow, by the time they're getting to the end, it's like, we're not really just saving ourselves. We're really not just saving our school or the really cool music store that we all work at. I love Mystic Force. It's now, this is going to threaten the entire world. This might threaten the entire universe. So anyway, getting back to should players buy this? It is 100% a strong yes from me. Sorry, I forgot to look. I always forget to look up prices before I do this. All right, so through the Shattered Grid, hardcover's $45 It's not out yet. It doesn't come out until March of next year, but they released the PDF super early. They released it last month. It's taken me this long to get this review done. So for players, can I justify $45 for the stuff that's in here? Abso-freaking-lutely yes. There's tons of mechanical stuff in here that you can use to improve either new characters or characters that you're already playing. There's tons of lore in here that you can use to kind of create more interesting, unique characters. And I'm going to be saying this over and over and over again, but the artwork in this book in particular, I think is probably the best artwork that Renegade has put out in any book thus far. One of the things that some people sometimes will have a slight issue with is how much of the Essence 20 books are literally just grabs from various comic runs. Like, they use comic artwork constantly. And this is everything. In Power Rangers, in G.I. Joe, in Transformers, even in My Little Pony, a lot of the artwork is they're just taking panels from comic books and putting it into the book, which is not bad. The comic artwork is brilliant and amazing. I am not 100% certain whether the artwork that they have in here is custom or if it's like they do use some stuff from the comic books, because I'm currently reading the Boom Studios run and I'm recognizing panels and things like that. Oh, I remember that scene. But there's some artwork, like the cover art, absolutely 100% has to be custom. Like, there's no possible way that this was not something that they ordered specifically for this book, because it's got the Magna Defender, a Guardian of Eltar, and the was it Matt Cook, I think his name is, the new Green Ranger in there with Draken on his throne behind him and a bunch of like helmets everywhere. Like, it's a gorgeous piece of artwork that I will assume is probably a conglomeration of a bunch. Like, I've seen that particular pose of Drakon on his throne before with the helmets. Like, that's a cover art from somewhere. But there's enough in there that had to be commissioned specifically for this. And yeah, like as I was doing the book, so anyway, to go back to players, yes, 100%, I do recommend this for players. The $45 for the hardcovers, Absolutely agree. Again, when you're dealing with shipping, if you're getting it directly from Renegade, it knocks it up another $10 plus tax. So that turns this into a $60 book. Even for $60, I think there's enough here for players to be able to justify $60 for this book, or get it through your local game store and don't pay shipping, and support a local business. So yeah, moving on. The second group. Should GMs buy this book? I make this kind of statement every single time I do one of these in-depth reviews because it's true every single time. For GMs, if your players want to use these players options, you need to have a copy of this book. So if your players are getting it, you're going to have to get it. Either you're going to have to borrow it from one of your players, or what generally tends to be a better idea is you get it for yourself. So from that aspect in and of itself, if I recommend it for players, I'm generally going to recommend it for GMs because they're going to need it for their players. However, this part of the review is not meant to go, hey, I recommend it for the other one, so you should get it too. I specifically want to talk about stuff that I am incredibly impressed about this particular book as it relates to GMs. So the way that the book is set up is you have, it's set up in 5 different chapters. The first one is basically just the intro, and it basically gives you the main characters you're going to be dealing with and some background to the Shattered Grid storyline in general. Which is nice. It's great for GMs. It's great for Lorehounds. It's great for players too. And then Chapter 2, Chapter 3, and Chapter 4 are basically 3 different arcs in the comics. The first one is the Shattered Grid and the various things that happened after that as the Shattered Grid was repairing itself. Chapter 3 is kind of the Imperials and that whole arc and the War with Eltar arc. And then Chapter 4 is basically the end of the Boom Studios. We start dealing with like the Death Ranger and stuff like that. In each one of those chapters, it'll start with player options. It will give, if there's new Zords or anything in there, they'll put that in there. And then they'll have a section called For the GM. And each one of these sections will talk about a major theme built into kind of that campaign. Like the first one for the Shattered Grid storyline. It's entitled Psychological Horror in Power Rangers. And it talks about one of the big issues in the very beginning of the Boom Studios Power Rangers comic. Tommy is dealing with, because the Boom Studios comic starts after Tommy has already joined the Power Rangers. He's already broken off Rita's control. They don't retell Green with Evil or anything like that, though that would have been really cool. So Tommy's already a part of the group, and for the first 10 or 15 issues, he is really, really struggling with kind of the trauma of everything that happened, of being mind controlled, of just everything. And he struggles with himself. He struggles with his own kind of identity. And there's a lot of psychological aspects to it. And so they have this entire section talking about, it's about a full page spread, just talking about how in a Power Rangers game specifically, how you can introduce kind of psychological torments for your Rangers and psychological issues. And probably the thing that I think they do best about this is the fact that they don't link it to, well, here's how you can give your characters major depressive disorder, or here's what panic disorder feels like. They're not trying to give your characters mental illnesses, which I'm massively against. I've said this many, many times before. Mental illnesses are not quirks that make your characters the more interesting. They're debilitating disabilities that vastly change your life. And if you find a way to kind of gamify them and turn them into a mechanic, you are insulting literally every single person that has ever had to struggle with them. And that's not what they do here. They literally talk about this is how psychology would affect your rangers, and this is how bad guys can use psychology against your rangers like real bad guys do all the time. And that's just one example of one of these For the GM sections. Each one talks about something a little bit different, and again, they phrase it for, okay, this is how you do it in a Power Rangers game. But a lot of the information that they have in here is useful for non-Power Rangers games. Again, they do spin it a little bit to make it fit into a very kind of heroic style adventure. Let's be honest, the vast majority of tabletop RPGs, you are playing heroes. There's not a ton of tabletop RPGs where you're playing either anti-heroes or villains. They exist, don't get me wrong, they're just not the majority. So the advice that they give in here, well, yes, slanted very heavily towards the kind of moral, the kind of moral after-school special almost aspect of Power Rangers, is interwoven in there so that you're not, doing stuff that's going to just feel really weird in a Power Rangers game. But as long as you, again, understand templating and understand how to kind of take out the Power Ranger stuff, this is just good advice for GMs that want different ways to challenge their characters, a lot of times without using any kind of roles. Again, I am vastly against the idea of, well, you're feeling really bad. You're feeling depressed right now, so make me a wisdom saving throw. And if you succeed, then you succeed against your depression. It's not how depression works. I know. I have depression. It's not fun. And if I could just go about my day because I made a wisdom saving throw, my life would be so much better. It's not how it worked. It's never how it's worked. If you want to have them roll a wisdom saving throw every 2 minutes in the game of actual playtime, not in-game time, but actual real playtime, that might get closer to simulating what it's like to struggle with major depressive disorder, especially if you can't be medicated for it like I can't. But that's not what this is. This is showing that, hey, your players are, or your player characters are going to be dealing with more than just, what cool weapon can I make next? Sometimes bad things are going to happen and it's going to affect them. And yeah, it's really, really interesting. In addition to that, tons of new threats in here. There are things like in the For the GM section for Shattered and Reforged, Chapter 2. The second kind of subheading there is Promethea and other new organizations in your game. It gives you kind of a building block for if you want to create organizations that your rangers can interact with. We've had organizations before, like they've introduced things like the Silver Guardians and countless other ones in other Power Rangers things. This actually gives you a guide on how to create them, and it uses Promethea as an example of, hey, this is it. So yeah, like each one of these For the GM sections, yes, is very, very useful if you're running the content in this game specifically, 100%. But so much of it is also useful in a bunch of different things. Like the guide on how to create an organization that sometimes can be allied with your player characters and sometimes is more adversarial to your player characters. That's something that you can use in any game. It doesn't even have to be an Essence 20 gig game. Just understanding the idea of, well, these are how organizations work, and this is how you can create an organization that is independent enough that it's not just always going to be, hey, we're the cheerleaders for the player characters. Having an organization that's going to interact with them and have its own opinions and have its own motivations and drives that sometimes align with the players and sometimes don't, creates a significantly more interesting experience for the players, and it makes the world feel more real. I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but there are a lot of different subgroups in the world, And despite the fact that these different subgroups may look like they align in a lot of their ideas, a lot of the times they're fighting against each other for a billion different reasons. And so, in a world that is real, you are going to have these little subgroups that form, whether they are cliques in high school, whether they are different advocacy groups for the same exact organization or the same exact ideals. You're always going to have people that they think that these people are doing it wrong and we're doing it right. And so you're always going to have these little subgroups. And so having something like that in there is very, very nice. It's very, very useful. So yeah, in addition to just having more tools that you can use when you're running Power Rangers games, this one, again, I think better than most of the other Essence 20 books I reviewed. I have a hard time putting this above either the Decepticon Directive or the Cobra, whatever the Cobra G.I. Joe one was, because that one in particular gives a brilliant overview into the mind of villains in general, which is something that's just not done very often, and a lot of people in general, specifically writers, do not understand how to write a compelling villain. So I'd have a hard time putting this above those as far as kind of necessary stuff for a game master to read to become a good game master. But this ranks real close up there just for the breadth of things that they talk about that can be extremely useful for GMs in general. So for $45, do I recommend GMs get the hardcover of this? Abso-freaking-lutely. It's a brilliantly well-written book. Design and layout I have some issues with. We'll talk about when we get into them. But overall, the book itself is well written. It's got some great advice, and it gives GMs just a ton of tools for their toolbox. And it has kind of an interesting little mini campaign that you could run, which again, when I do the in-depth review portion of this in-depth review, I'll talk about some of the stuff that I'm not particularly fond about it. But overall, it's an interesting little adventure that does introduce some cool ideas, including the idea of giving the players the choice between two different groups that, again, have the same end goal, but have two very different ways of going about that. And again, if you understand the idea of templating, which is basically being able to like take out all of the like plot and lore and just look at the actual mechanics of, well, this is how this works, you can use that to create significantly more interesting choices for your player characters. So yeah, overall recommend it for Geeky Game Masters. Moving on. The third group. Should Lorehounds buy this book? I've mentioned this, I think, in every single Essence 20 book I've ever reviewed. One of the things that the Essence 20 team does probably better than almost any other tabletop RPG designer I've ever read is they are phenomenally good at weaving their lore into their source books and books in general. One of my biggest issues with D&D 5.5 is the fact that they have done everything they can to take all of the lore out of Dungeons and Dragons. They simply want to give you mechanics that you can use however you want, but it's turned the game into a very, very hollow kind of imitation of what it used to be. And Essence 20 simply just doesn't do that. Everything they do starts lore first, and then it translates into mechanics. And that means that the mechanics themselves, first of all, are much more tied to the lore in general. Second of all, the mechanics themselves just feel better, because you're not sitting there going, well, this doesn't make sense that you can do this, and you know, like, why can't I, why do I put my fingers together and shoot a wall of fire? Why can't I make it a wall of ice? It doesn't make any sense. Whereas in this, every single time you're looking at ability, it goes, oh, that makes sense because it's tied to this aspect of the ranger or this aspect of the villain or something like that. So when we're looking at this one, even compared to other books that I've reviewed, there is just a shit ton of lore in here. Like, there is not a single page where you are not having at least a little bit of lore. Even when you're looking at the new player options and stuff like that, which tends to be much more focused on mechanics because they have to be. There's still a ton of lore just everywhere in the book. And as I mentioned before, the artwork in this book is bonkers. Again, I understand a lot of it is taken directly from the comics, which isn't a bad thing. Again, the comics are beautiful. But there's enough stuff in the book that just looks so brilliant and so amazing. Like some of the stuff, like I remember the pages from the comics where some of the artwork comes from. But then we'll see other things that either they're an alternate cover that I just completely missed, or they have to be custom made for this. And I know somebody that wrote this book watched my last video on it and said that they were interested in hearing this. So if you are watching this, and you are allowed to, I understand a lot of times you're not allowed to say a lot, I would be interested to know. First of all, I'm almost 100% certain the cover art for this was 100% commissioned. I'd be interested to know, is there a lot more commissioned art in this than other books? Or am I just forgetting the pages from the comics that you guys got this artwork from? So, again, I understand you may not be allowed to say, but my theory is it feels like there's a lot more commissioned artwork for this one than there has been for other books. And even if it's not a lot more commissioned than normal, the artwork that you guys chose is just freaking gorgeous. There are so many times when I turned a page and I just went, wow, that is amazing. And it happens over and over and over and over again. So for Lorehounds, obviously, the lore in here is going to be really, really good. But just as good is going to be just the feast of artwork that they have everywhere. It's so gorgeous. Over and over and over again, you get these amazing pieces of artwork. And they're, oh man, so good. So, do I recommend this for Lorehounds? Absolutely. There are so many different things. Like, you can spend hours reading this book, and you can reread sections over and over again, because the lore here is not only plentiful, it's dense. They put a lot of information into a small amount of words. Yeah, absolutely, really, really good, amazing stuff. Moving on. So, as a quick recap of our recommendations. Players, absolutely, tons of players options, tons of lore stuff that you can use to make your new characters, make your characters more interesting, and tons of new stuff that you can use for existing characters. For GMs, absolutely recommend it, not only because of all the new stuff for your toolbox, but also because they have quite a few different sections that just teach you how to challenge your players in new and interesting ways that doesn't involve, making them roll dice in a different way. So definitely do that. And then for Lorehounds, absolutely yes. This is one of the most lore-packed books they put out in a long time. It's great. The artwork is amazing. You're going to love it. So, that is the Should You Buy It. If the only reason you came to this video is figuring out if you want to purchase this book, thank you so much for watching it. Again, please remember to like, subscribe, turn notifications on in the comments down below. What are you most excited about this particular book? Is it the Shattered Grid stuff? Is it, the stuff from Beyond the Shattered Grid? Or even like the Death Ranger and stuff like that? Are you super happy to see the Hyperforce Rangers finally introduced into the Power Rangers RPG? Let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, it is time for us to get into the in-depth review. Now, as a reminder, this is going to be an in-depth review. And when I say in-depth, I mean in-depth. I'm going to go chapter by chapter, sometimes page by page. I'm going to talk about the things that I like. I'm going to talk about the things that I don't like. I'm going to talk about the things they did well. I'm going to talk about the things they think they need to do better. Because of this turns into a very, very long video. Much longer than most people have to listen to me talk about Power Rangers. So I will have timestamps in here. If you do not want to watch this all in one sitting, feel free. I'm going to choke in just a second here. Hold on. Much better. Feel free to watch this in multiple sittings. I understand YouTube wants you to sit here and just watch nothing but my video for 7 bajillion years. I just don't think that's really possible. So the timestamps are in here for you. Use them. That being said, I think it is time for us to start this in-depth review. The first section, the introduction, is the shortest introduction they've ever had. It's literally just, welcome to the Through the Shattered Grid source book for the Power Rangers role-playing game. In this book introduces new player options, enemies, and plots from the Boom comic series Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, and some elements from Go-Go Power Rangers and some specials. It's just them basically saying, hey, this is what's in the book, and they talk about each different chapter. So it's simple, it's basic, nothing we need to really focus on. Moving on to Chapter 1, Beyond the Shadows. So this is your basic overall intro to the ideas behind the Shattered Grid, which if you're not familiar with, the Shattered Grid was something that was introduced in the Power Rangers comics relatively early on. And it eventually made its way into the Power Rangers TV series with a particular character, Lord Draven, 100% being based on Lord Drakon. But basically, the idea behind the Shattered Grid was, in an alternate universe, after Tommy was defeated by Jason, and Jason destroys the Sword of Darkness, which was the thing that was kind of controlling Tommy's mind, instead of, in that scene in normal Power Rangers, he kind of helps Tommy up and he goes, Tommy, we need your help. You should join us. And Tommy joins the Power Rangers. In this reality, Tommy doesn't join the Power Rangers at that point. He's like, how could you want me? Why in the world would you ever trust me? And he kind of goes off to mope. While he's moping, Rita approaches him again. And instead of mind controlling him, she just convinces him, goes, hey, join me. Look at how the world has worked when they're left to their own devices. Obviously, humanity needs some guidance, and we can be the ones that give them that. With the power of the Green Ranger helping Rita, Tommy is able to eventually defeat the Power Rangers, and the last-ditch effort that the Power Rangers and Zordon have to try and defeat him is they create the White Ranger powers, and they intend to give the White Ranger powers to Jason, because he's the one that can really go toe-to-toe with Tommy. So as they are finalizing the White Ranger powers, Tommy attacks the command center, ends up killing Jason, and steals the White Ranger powers, merges them with his Green Ranger powers, and he creates the iconic Drakon armor, and he takes the name Lord Drakon. Fast forward a few dozen years, and Drakon has basically taken over the world. But he eventually, through a mistake or something, finds out that there's an alternate reality where Tommy joined the Power Rangers, and he starts becoming obsessed with the idea that there's a version of him that is good, and he hated that. And so that starts this idea of the Shattered Grid, where he literally starts going to different versions of himself and different areas of the Power Rangers to kind of steal their powers and become more and more powerful, specifically to be able to deal with this version of Tommy that isn't a bad guy. There's a lot of psychological stuff that goes on before it, but the morphing grid, in order to protect reality, actually literally shatters reality into these little pieces where each Power Rangers team is now encapsulated and separated into their own separate reality. So during the Shattered Grid storyline, the Samurai Rangers were in a completely different reality than the Megaforce Rangers. And the Dino Charge Rangers are in a completely different reality than the Ninja Storm Rangers. That's what the Shattered Grid is in and of itself. The comics run is amazing. It is phenomenally good. If you get a chance to read it, you can get a lot of them are now collected in hardbound collections. Like I have the entire Shattered Grid comic run in a hardcover, and it's gorgeous and amazing. I got it for Christmas one year. But that's what this chapter 1 is basically kind of setting up. Not just the idea of the Shattered Grid, but it's basically creating the foundation that the Boom Studio Comics universe runs on. It talks about kind of the origin of the morphing grid, where Dark Spectre comes from. It talks about some key people. Dark Spectre, it introduces Grace Sterling, who in the comics was actually technically the first Red Ranger in 1969. And that in and of itself is a really interesting story. Talks about Drakon, talks about Dread. It talks about Rita and the various flavors of Rita that exist. It brings up the Ranger Slayer, who's one of my favorite characters ever. And then it talks about a few different locations that are important in order for you to be able to understand Shattered Grid in and of itself. Because Shattered Grid and the stuff that happens after it gets confusing really, really quickly if you don't understand the basics. So that's what chapter 1 is it's just kind of given the basis of, okay, this is the stuff that you need to know for the rest of this stuff to make sense. And it's well done. It's remarkably well done. So, yeah, not a whole lot else I can talk about without going into too much spoilers, but yeah. Moving on. Chapter 2. Shattered and Reforged. This, again, is going to be covering most of the stuff that happens involving the Shattered Grid storyline and the stuff that happened immediately after that. Basically, big spoiler alert for Shattered Grid. What happens with Shattered Grid is Tommy, again, starts going to different realities after the Morphing Grid breaks every single Ranger team up into their own reality. Tommy starts jumping into different ones to basically start grabbing more powers for himself by stealing morphers. Because he finds out very quickly that his powers can't actually absorb multiple spectrums from the same team. So he starts going off and stealing powers from a bunch of different teams, and each time he does, he will get extra powers that he goes and uses to create these things that he calls Ranger Sentries, which basically he takes the connection to the Morphing Grid that a particular Power Ranger uses, like the Tyrannosaurus Power Coin. He uses that to empower an entire kind of legion of kind of pseudo-rangers that he calls his Ranger Sentries. The Tyranno Ranger Sentries look kind of similar to the Red Ranger, but there's a lot more white. They have a cool looking cape, and their main weapon is the Power Sword, but like two of them that are joined at the hilt. So it's like a double-bladed Power Sword. It's super cool. There's a bunch of different flavors of Ranger Sentries. So after he does that, again, another major spoiler alert, he eventually wins. and he creates his own reality where he's not the villain, he's actually the hero, and everybody loves him and things like that. But stuff happens, and that reality eventually just can't continue going on. He has kind of a heart-to-heart with the good version of himself, and that reality implodes. And then the grid itself kind of reassembles and goes back to how it was before, almost. There are repercussions of the grid being shattered and then him basically rearranging reality to create this one prime dimension. And so that's where the Beyond the Shattered Grid storyline goes. And there's a few different things, like the Ranger Slayer forms a team of Power Rangers to deal with some stuff. If I remember correctly, I can't remember if it was the Ranger Slayer that goes into... I think, yeah, the Ranger Slayer goes into the Void and has to deal with this place where there's no Morphin Grid. Yeah, so all of that stuff happens in Shattered and Reforged, which, again, was probably like the first half of the comic book run. So that's what this chapter is about, and it introduced a bunch of new player options, and this is where my first problem with the layout comes from for this book. First of all, the actual fonts and typesets that they use, I'm still not particularly fond of, because it makes it difficult to figure out where new things start, because they generally use the same size font and the same color font for multiple different subheadings. I wish they either had another font type or something to make it easier for you to figure out where new things are going. It's not super bad in the player options area, because it's basically the influence section, because it's basically the influences in red, and then all of these sub things under the influence are black with a gold underline. That's perfectly fine. As we get further away from the influences, where they start getting more kind of interesting things and more kind of subdivisions that you have to deal with, it starts getting significantly more easy or more difficult to be able to read and understand where one thing starts and another thing finishes. This is not the first time this has happened in Essence 20 books. I don't know what the term for... I used to know the term for it. There's a term for like the actual like fonts and headings that you're allowed to use. All that stuff is chosen by somebody. And to make everything uniform, whenever you're doing this stuff, you're required, like, you use this heading for this and use this typeface for this and all that stuff. I think the Essence 20 team needs to pick up another couple typesets or something so that you have more variety in here. This has been a problem since the beginning of the Essence 20 system. I don't know if it's ever going to change unless we get like an Essence 20 2.0 version or second edition. But yeah, it's not egregious here, but there's a couple places where I had to reread it like 3 or 4 times to figure out, okay, what is this referencing? Because I don't see where the break is. There's also some slight issues with the fact that page breaks are not done particularly well, where you will have a lot of things that start on one page and continue on another, which is fine if it's 2 page, like the book itself, you'll have a left and a right page. It's fine if the page break goes through a seam effectively, but if it's on the back of another page, that makes it significantly more difficult to understand, because you have to actually change the page and flip back and forth and stuff like that. So those aspects, again, it doesn't ruin the book for me. I still think it's a fantastic book, but layout and design of the book has been an issue in Essence 20 books before, and this one is flirting with the problems. It's not as bad as some of like the G.I. Joe books, which were just atrocious in certain places, but it's not phenomenal. The other thing I am not particularly fond of is, like, here's a really good example. So, to introduce, they have player options is done in a large, probably like a 16 or 20 point font, bold, probably like 18 or 20 point font, and it's this bold gold color. And then each different influence is done in like a 16-point font, and it's red. And then the subheadings, the perk, the hang-up, suggested characteristics, those are probably done in like a 14-point font. They're black and they have a gold underline that goes the entire column. That works perfect. However, when you switch from influences to origins, there's no new big gold thing going origins. You just have origin, coinless resistance, and it looks exactly the same as influence better together. So there's nothing visual that is explaining to me, oh, we're no longer dealing with influences, we're now dealing with origins. And the same thing is true when they introduce the Magna Defender role, which is the role that's introduced in this chapter. It is the exact same font, it's the exact same size, it's the exact same color as the origin, but it's a brand new thing. And it begins on a page break. You have new role, Magna Defender, you have a single paragraph, and then you have a full page break where you switch over and you have a brand new set of information. I think this would have worked significantly better if they had added in something to go origins so that we could see that, okay, now we're talking about origins, and then shifted Magna Defender to start on a brand new page so that now we know, okay, this is definitely something new. And that's the other thing that I have an issue with throughout the entire book is each chapter, or at least I think chapter 4 has, chapter 4 is, so each chapter has player options. And what that means is, from a thematic standpoint, it makes sense that, okay, we're going to link things that were associated with the Shattered Grid, we're going to put in the Shattered Grid chapter, and things associated with like the Outer Universe and the Omega Rangers stuff we're going to put in the next chapter. However, what it means from a practical standpoint is you have to do a lot of page turning and flipping if you want to kind of combine stuff from different things, which I don't really see a problem doing. I mean, in the comic books, the Power Rangers go through all of these different things. The singular Power Rangers, the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers team of Jason, Zach, Trini, and then eventually Rocky, Adam, Aisha, Kimberly, Billy, Tommy, they go through all of these things. So it doesn't make sense that grid powers from chapter 3 can't be used with a character that uses the Magna Defender role or anything like that. Or that you might have players, from a GM standpoint, that some of them are using, like you might have a player playing using the Magna Defender role, and then another player using the new Eltarian Guardian role. And that means that you are flipping through massive sections of the book. You don't have it all kind of in one spot. Again, I understand why they did it. I understand the choice that they made. I don't think it was the right choice because, again, I think it makes the book more difficult to read and becomes a little bit more jarring because you are constantly going from heavy lore to heavy mechanics, back to heavy lore to heavy mechanics to heavy lore to heavy mechanics. And again, the layout for this, I understand. Here's another thing that if you're not into like publishing and printing and stuff like that, adding a single extra page is not simple. As much as it sounds simple, it's like it's just one more page. It's not. It's unbelievably complicated because something that a lot of people don't realize is when you print a book, you actually print 4 pages at once. Because what you do is you have a single large piece of paper that will have 1 page here, 1 page here, and then on the back we'll have another page here and another page here. And if you're doing traditional bookbinding, you punch holes in it and you kind of thread them all together so you can flop through it. But basically, anytime you change a single page, you actually have to readjust bare minimum 4 different pages because now they have to be printed in a very different way in order for everything to work. And because, again, everything is done in things of 4, that means if you change the number of pages in the book, you might at the end of the book have extra pages that no longer have print on them anymore. You have to decide how you want to deal with those extra pages. So I understand putting extra pages, putting in additional line breaks and things like that is a lot more complicated and costly than I'm making it out to be. However, none of the problems I have in this book are big enough that I think it would kind of justify a new printing style of Cost. However, if it was viewed from the beginning from a readability standpoint, I think this book could have been much easier to use. Like, good example, for the Magna Defender roll, again, it starts on page 21, and it's just the lower corner of page 21. Starts with new roll, the Magna Defender, has a single paragraph there. Then we go to the next page. We have upper, what is that, quarter? No. Upper like sixth of the page is just a picture of the Magna Defender. It's a badass looking picture. The Magna Defender, he's got his Magnus sword there, and he's like, "Urgh." It's a really cool picture. And then we have lore stuff. And then we get to the Spectrum roll features, grid equipment, Magna Power. And then on the next page, we have the table for the Magna Defender and a table for their weapons. Very easily, if they had shifted the Magna Defender table, the weapons of the Magna Defender, to the other page, so it was right underneath the picture of the Magna Defender, and then finished the page off with the lore stuff, Honorable Legacy, Adaptable Combatants, Zorform. Those three paragraphs could have done the bottom of that. Then we would have all of the mechanics on a single page instead of dividing them amongst a bunch of different pages and making everything seem really weird, because the Magna Defender table seems really out of place. The weapons of the Magna Defender seem really out of place, because everywhere else where they've introduced a special weapon, they will just put it with the rest of the weapons later on in the book. Here they specifically have it here, while they also have a specific section for weapons later on. That gets confusing. Like I said, layout-wise, there is some stuff that could have been done significantly better. And my suggestion here would not have created additional pages. It's simply swapping things around to make it look and just work better. And probably getting rid of the weapons of the Magna Defender and just leaving that with the rest of the weapons, because that's just two rows. Like, that would not create a huge issue. And that would make it so that everything can fit and make significantly more sense than it does right now. So that's my biggest issue with the book in general, is just layout is not great. It's not bad in any way, shape, or form, but there's a lot of stuff that, again, it requires you to flip between pages, and page breaks for abilities and stuff like that go over page turns, which is just not a good idea. Even though I'm reading a digital copy, I read it in book form, to where I can see both sides. If I was actually reading the book, I can see where the scene would be and everything like that. And having mechanics be explained on both sides of a page turn is just a bad idea in general. It creates issues at the table all the time. So yeah. After getting through, the new Origins, the new Magna Defender roll, which I like, is really, really interesting. It's very personal power heavy. There's a couple abilities in there that if I ever do an in-depth review, or not an in-depth review, an Essential Essence 20 on the Magna Defender roll, I'll have a few things I'm like, this might need to be changed a little bit, just because they're not 100% clear on them. But overall, it's a really, really cool, again, very unique Ranger. It doesn't play like the other Rangers. And that's the thing that I like the most. And then they have a bunch of different general perks. Again, cool stuff. One thing that I am getting a little bit annoyed about, Magna Defender has the at all cost ability, which I think now 3 different Rangers have the exact same 18th level ability, which is basically when you reach 0, you don't die effectively. you just, instead of using health, you use personal power. Again, it's not that it's a bad ability. It's a really, really good ability. But now we have like 3 or 4 different rangers that have the exact same ability. It's getting old. It fits with the Magna Fender, don't get me wrong, but it's getting old. If you wanted it to be something that multiple Power Rangers can have it, either make it a general perk or a grid power, but don't give this same class ability to multiple different classes, especially high-level class abilities. Low-level class abilities, I'm generally a little bit more okay with. Okay, yeah, we can give multiple. Like, I have no problem with a bunch of different classes getting extra attack, but at all cost, it's just showed up too many times. It's the exact same power. It's an 18th level ability, and too many Rangers. It's the exact same thing. Modify it in some way, change it so that it actually, incorporates something for that particular role, and I don't have as big an issue. But with so many of the new ones having it, it's just not fun anymore. Then we go into various different general perks, some grid powers. They do introduce the metallic armor. If anyone doesn't remember metallic armor from, I think it was season 3 of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, it was just glitter. That's all it was. They glitterized their armor. It was sparkly armor, and here they actually make it pretty badass, which I'm happy. And then another thing that they do, they introduce some new team perks, which is interesting, but they also introduce contacts in every single section. The contact system in Essence 20 is one of my favorite things about Essence 20 in general, because it's a way to reward players for caring about the NPCs and creating relationships with them. The way the contact system works in general is you have to do something to earn the respect of the contact. And when you do, you can actually call them to help you in battle, like a special attack or something like that. And each contact will have a set amount of what are called allegiance points. And they'll have a bunch of different perks that they can use that will burn those allegiance points. And once the allegiance points are gone, the contact goes away. It's such a great way to give a mechanical benefit to caring about the NPCs in your campaign. And again, yes, you can use the contacts here exactly the way they are. But if you understand templating, it is a great way for you to be able to convince the players that these NPCs are more than just funny voices and places where they get cool stuff. These are real imaginary people that have lives and have relationships, and it makes the players more invested in the world, which is probably the hardest thing that a GM has to do, is find a way to get the player character or the players invested in the world itself and not just their characters. It's generally not very difficult for players to get invested in their characters because they make the characters themselves. But getting them invested in the world, getting them to care about a random imaginary person that you just made up is extremely difficult. But when there's a contact system where anyone they meet could eventually become an ally that they can call when they really need them, that gives them an incentive to get invested in the world. So I love that. The contacts that they introduce in this chapter are a little bit spoilery, so I'm not going to say them specifically. But they're cool contacts. I'll mention Grace Sterling is a contact that you can get. Lord Drakon is a contact that you can get. That in and of itself is nonsense. He's, again, for a large portion of the comic series, he's the bad guy. And you can gain him as a contact depending on what happens in your particular games, which I find hilarious. Also, they introduced Z, or Zai. I don't know how you pronounce his name, but he is probably one of my favorite characters of the Omega kind of aspect of the comic books. He's such a cool character. I love him to death. Z's here. He's great. They introduced a bunch of new weapons, which again is great. The SS-20 system in and of itself, I've said this a billion times before, I'll say it again. Your weapons are just as important in how you play your character as your role, as your origin, and as your influences. And the stuff that they introduce here, A lot of it is the weapons from the sentries, which are super cool. I love the Ranger sentries in the comics. I think they're one of the coolest things that the comics introduce, because there's so many interesting things that introduces from a pure lore perspective. The idea that like the blue samurai sentries exist because Tommy went to the samurai's universe and stole the blue samurai morpher. I think he also might have stolen the green, and he added that power to himself, but he couldn't use two of them, so he plugs that into his sentry machine, and now an entire group of soldiers now can access a limited portion of the blue samurai ranger's power, and it manifests as these blue samurai sentries, which are super cool. They have these like katana bracers. They have like a katana on their arms, and they have like shurikens that they can throw, and it's super, super cool. But the lore implications of that is just fascinating. First of all, it means that they have to be connected to this morpher that they're not wearing. Power Rangers are always wearing their morpher, and if you rip their morpher off, they don't immediately demorph, but it causes issues. And there have been quite a few situations where, like, if you take the Red Ranger's power coin, like there have been scenes in Mighty Morphin Power Rangers where the Red Ranger has taken his coin out, and as soon as he lets go of the coin, he demorphs. So once he's no longer in physical contact with his thing that gives him the ability to morph, he no longer has access to that power. But the blue samurai sentries and the sentries in general have this kind of remote connection to a morpher that they've never touched. And that also creates interesting situations for the players. If they're ever dealing with sentry-style enemies, yeah, you can fight the sentries, or you can send someone to unplug the sentries and they lose their powers. Like, that idea in and of itself is super, super cool. And I don't think it's particularly focused on in the comics that much. Again, I haven't read the whole thing. And my memory's so bad that there are parts of the comics that I already have forgotten. But yeah, so they have all these different sentry weapons that are super cool that they introduce here. It's just cool. I love it to death. They explain shields again. Shields are something that was introduced. I can't even remember where they introduced it. It might have been either a Transformers or G.I. Joe book. But shields are now a thing that you can get in the Essence 20 system. One of my favorite things about them, they have unique mechanics where shields can have an active and passive form. Active means you're holding the shield and defending yourself with it. Passive means you're just wearing the shield on your arm. And I love everything about that. Because, again, it changes how you play the game. Then they introduce one new vehicle, the Green Drakon Mech. And then some new Zord features and stuff like that, which are really, really cool. One of them being a mesh Zord, which is basically, if you are familiar with, what's it called? The Grave Zord. If you don't know what that is, I'm not going to spoil it for you, but the Grave Zord was a thing. Mesh Zords are how you would create your own Grave Zord. So that in and of itself is pretty cool. And then they have a bunch of new Zord things. Things like restraining chains. If you want your character... I think the Triceratops had a thing where it could shoot its horns off and they would have chains on them. And I know there have been other Zords that have had this thing where they could shoot something off and kind of wrap up a character. Now you have a grid or a Zord perk that allows you to do that, which I really, really like. So yeah, and then they go through a bunch of new Zords for this thing, which includes the Thunder Zords, which I'm a big, big fan. A bunch of Promethean flavors of Zords, which is cool. The Magna Defender Zords, which you need for the Magna Defender role. Yeah, then we get to the GM section for this chapter, the For the GM. And again, I mentioned this in the Should GMs Buy This, but this particular GM section talks about psychological horror in Power Rangers and how to have your rangers deal with kind of the psychology of what it is that they're doing and how enemies might focus on that. And that's actually something that happened in Power Rangers often. There was an entire monster that was based on Billy's phobia of fish. There was another one where Trini had to overcome her fear of heights. So the idea of using your rangers, not your players, your rangers' fears against them is something that happens constantly in Power Rangers. And this gives you a really good example of how, not just how to use actual fears and phobias, like a fear of height or a fear of fish or something, but other things like a fear of rejection, or the thing that Tommy struggled with for a long time was the idea of how much of what I did when I was the evil Green Ranger was Rita and how much of it was me. What if I'm actually an evil person and all Rita did was give me a reason to be the real me? That's something that Tommy struggles with in the comics for a while. And it's a really profound thing to struggle with. Kind of coming to terms with your own motivations and your own kind of pitfalls and struggles is a really, really intense thing to deal with, first of all. But it does create significantly more interesting characters. And again, none of this is about, okay, let's give them this thing that we found in the DSM-5. Don't do that. Do not sit there and go, well, now that you're afraid of fish, we're going to say that you have fishophobia, and now every time you see a fish, you roll a d4, and on a 4, you can't do anything for 4 hours. Don't do that. Don't gamify mental illness. It's not a game. It's not fun. Don't play with that. But the idea of villains targeting the insecurities of the Rangers, it's 100% a Power Rangers kind of thing to do. It's 100% an evil kind of thing to do. Here's a news flash for you folks. There are actual evil people in this world. They're remarkably rare. The amount of people that think that a massive portion of the population is absolutely evil and disgusting boggles my mind, because truly evil people exist, and they're rare because the human brain and the human body just doesn't react well to being a truly evil person. It takes a special kind of makeup of your brain to actually be an evil person. That being said, truly evil people, and even not so like truly evil people, but abusers and things like that, which I, again, don't believe that all abusers are absolutely evil people. The vast majority of abusers are people that were abused that didn't learn how to deal with that abuse in the right way, and now they were basically taught how to abuse people by the person that abused them, and now they're doing what they were taught. Monkey see, monkey do. But a lot of abusers and things like that, like this is what they look for. Fun fact, the easiest way to become a bully magnet when you were a kid is to walk around with hunched shoulders and looking at the ground, because bullies look for easy targets. And that is a physical manifestation of, I don't have high self-esteem. I cannot tell you how much my life changed when I started walking with my shoulders back and started looking forward instead of looking at the ground when I walked. People stopped bullying me because I no longer looked like someone that would be easy to bully. But bullies look for they look for insecurities. And another really interesting thing, they did a study once to figure out what makes you cool. To be cool, you only need to be able to do two things. One, you need to be able to read people relatively well. Two, you need to be able to lie. It's the only thing. Nothing else matters. Doesn't matter if you're good looking, bad looking, whatever. Doesn't matter if you're smart, dumb, whatever. Doesn't matter if you're rich, poor, whatever. The only two things you need to be cool is you need to be able to read people. You need to be able to lie. Because cool kids, as a whole, are good enough at reading people to know what they want to hear, and are good enough at lying to be able to say what the person wants to hear and have them believe it. A lot of bullies are relatively good at rating people in particular to be able to figure out what their insecurities are so that they can attack those insecurities. That's what this psychological horror in Power Rangers is kind of dealing with, is how can your villains learn to psychologically attack the Rangers? And again, it's something that I haven't seen played out in a tabletop RPG, and I think it's really, really cool. It's very well done here. It doesn't start flirting with give them mental illnesses or anything like that. It's just a well-written thing that, again, can be used in any tabletop RPG, but it works well here. After that section, they have Promethea and other major new organizations in your game. This is the kind of, how to build an organization and how to mechanically have them do stuff. Again, very, very useful. There's not a whole lot I can say about it. And then I think this is the final section. Let me look. Before the threats. They have a thing, foils as villains. This is another thing that I find really, really interesting. Basically, and this is something that happens in Power Rangers all the time. I think it happened a little bit more in early Power Rangers than it does in later Power Rangers, but it does show up a little bit more cliched in later Power Rangers. But basically, a foil is something, is a character that is somehow related to the Ranger team that's going to act as a foil to them. It could be that there's an actual relationship. They are a family member, they are a friend, something like that. It could just be that they have a similar background or they have a similar situation, so that the player character will instantly kind of identify with that character. Like, let's say you have a player character that maybe, works in construction or something over the summer, and you have another person does this is the same thing, or they both live on the same side, same side of town, or they both come from maybe they're both children of divorce or something like that. The thing with a foil is it should be something that a player character can look at and kind of see themselves in it in some way, but the foil makes different decisions in the player character, and those different decisions cause the foil to start to become an antagonist and someone that actively fights against that player. And again, it's a really, really great section that kind of talks about the whole idea of a foil and how to do it, especially when you start talking about multiple realities and stuff like that. You can definitely get into some interesting foils there. And then the last two sections, you have Saba and other sentient weapons, self-explanatory, and how to run a captured villain, which is another thing that can be really interesting and fun if you want to get into that. So, final section, threats. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a bunch of bad guy stat blocks. The vast majority of them are sentries, with a few things like Prometheus security personnel thrown in there. But they're all stuff that we've talked about already. They have a few kind of bigger things that I would give you the name of, but they're really, really spoilery for later stuff in the comics, so I'm not going to. But they even have a stat block for Draken. So yeah, love that. Anyway, moving on. Chapter 3, Worlds Beyond. One of the things I like about this is in the kind of introduction to each section, it talks about the comics and which issues that these particular things are drawn from. Like for this one, this chapter details the expansive universe explored in Mighty Morphin Power Rangers issues 51 through 55, and the stories told in the separate Power Rangers and Mighty Morphin series. For anyone that doesn't know, when Boom Studios first started their run, they had the series was called Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, and that was the one that started shortly after Tommy had joined the Rangers as the Green Ranger, and it goes on from there. A little bit later on, they started a new series called Go-Go Power Rangers, which was the same universe, but it was all the stories told before Tommy joined. So the very early Power Ranger stuff. Those two series eventually intertwined during the Shattered Grid crossover of event, and eventually Go-Go Power Rangers ended, and it was just Mighty Morphin Power Rangers for a little bit. And then they separated the series again into two different series, where you had Power Rangers was one series, and Mighty Morphin was another, whereas Power Rangers was dealing, I think, with the Omega Rangers, which was Jason, Trini, and Zach when they went on to that peace conference. They actually went to space and became the Omega Rangers. And then Mighty Morphin was Tommy as the White Ranger and all that other stuff that there. So it's specifically saying, hey, if you've read these series, this is the stuff that we're going to be talking out here. And that particular place, because you now have Space Rangers, Spacebound Rangers, and Homebound Rangers, lots of really interesting stuff starts happening. They introduced the idea of the Imperials, which are basically these kind of forces of nature monsters. These are like Tarask level enemies. As far as like, if you want to compare it to D&D, where they're not so much something that you beat as you survive. There was also a little subsection of that comic series where they deal with Eltar and Eltarians kind of returning and dealing with that. Again, I'm not going to spoil, but cool stuff. They introduced some new player options, which this runs into the exact same problem that I have with the other stuff, which is stuff going over page breaks and page turns, not enough kind of fonts to separate the things correctly. But overall, it's cool stuff. The new role, Guardian of Eltar, is probably the most different role that we've had for any Power Rangers thing. Because first of all, they're not a Power Ranger. And unlike the Magna Defender role, Magna Defender has their own unique morphing call. It's specifically called Magna Power, but it works the exact same as morphing. And at the very bottom, it says this role perk counts as its Morphin Time role perk for the purpose of acquiring and using grid powers, general perks and grid powers. Anything that affects its Morphin Time also affects this role perk. So they specifically mention Magna Power is just Magna Defender's version of its Morphin Time. For the new Guardian of Eltar, it doesn't say that. They have its Morphin Time style thing, but it's called a Guardian of Eltar, and I'm going to read this word for word because I think it's priceless. Starting at first level, you can summon the energy within you by using your Power Morpher and saying the words, "You've got a Guardian of Eltar," as a standard action. That's their morphing call. The interesting thing about this is it doesn't have that addendum of, by the way, this works the exact same way as its Morphin Time. So, and I don't know if that was a mistake in this printing, because we're going to talk about a couple other things that are absolutely 100% just mistakes in the printing. I don't know if that was just an oversight or a mistake, or if this is actually meant to be, no, Guardians of Eltar cannot use any grid power that requires its Morphin Time, any general perk that requires its Morphin Time. They are not Power Rangers. And if it is intentional, I find that very, very cool. If it isn't intentional, it's still a cool role. But yeah, it means it is very, very different. The role itself, again, plays very, very different. They have personal power, and they have this thing called Eltarian Tech, which is just another limited resource, which is not uncommon. There's quite a few different roles that have that. But they do have some pretty interesting things, including, and this is something that gets me very, very confused. They have Rally Guardians. So at 3rd level, you've been given command of a small company of fellow Eltarian Guardians. These Guardians are summoned to aid you in battle. Unlike a Zord, you rally your company of warriors using the Persuasion skill, and you cannot suffer a snag, blah, 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 blah. Your company of Guardians uses the same rules and statistics for Zords as they appear on page 131 of the Power Rangers game core rulebook. So basically, instead of, if you're playing an Eltarian Guardian, you don't get to call a Zord. You just get to call more Guardians to you, and your group of Guardians work the same way as a Zord. They just can't be Zords. It's confusing to say the least. Effectively, what it looks like from a mechanical standpoint is you have a Zord, it just can't combine with other Zords. But they don't call it a Zord, you're just a bunch of Guardians. And that in and of itself is weird. Another thing, they have a couple different mistypes. Page 72, if anyone that actually makes this stuff is here. Page 72, under Rally Guardians feature, your company of Guardians gains Zoid features. I was not aware that there were Zoids in this. You guys misspelled Zord. Instead of Z-O-R-D, it's Z-O-I-D. And then when you get to extra attack, still on page 72, second column, top. Begin 5th level, you can attack twice instead of once. Whenever you take the attack action on your turn, the number of attacks increases to 2 when you reach to 15th level, which isn't right. You already have 2 attacks. Either it should say the number of additional attacks increases to 2, or it should say, as it does in any other one, that 2 should be a 3. So, yeah, again, I think it's just a typo. But yeah, that needs to be fixed. And I think there might be a few other typos in here. Specifically, the Guardian of Eltar section had a lot more typos than I'm used to seeing in one tiny little section, so... Excuse me. So, yeah, overall, other than the weird thing with the Rally Guardians thing, it's an interesting, role that, again, plays very, very differently than other roles. And yeah, then we get into new general perks, only a single new grid power, and then a bunch of new contacts, which again are very, very cool, including an extremely spoilerific contact that I haven't actually gotten to in my read through of the comics, but I know is coming, and it's just cool. I like it. Again, I'm not going to spoil it, but it's great. And then this one actually introduces a few new gear stuff, specifically more tailored towards giving Eltarian Guardians the ability to do the stuff that they need to do. Lore-wise, Guardians of Eltar are actually sent out to other planets kind of undercover to kind of observe what's happening in the morphing grid there. And so there's a bunch of gear that's meant to kind of help with that. Some new weapons like the Eltarian Dual Blade, which is just a friggin' cool weapon. New vehicle, and then a bunch of new Zord features, which again is cool. And then they introduced some new Zords. One of them is the Promethea Dragon Zord. Slight spoiler for the comics. Eventually, Grace Sterling and Promethea get the green power cord, and they make their own Green Ranger, dude by the name of Matt Cook. He has his own Dragon Zord, which is cool. It's the same Dragon Zord that Tommy had, but they upgraded and modify it now that he's a member of Promethea. That Dragon Zord, because it's been upgraded, actually gets the ability to combine with the Thunder Megazord, or the Thunder Zords, and the White Tiger Zord. So they have a White Tiger Dragon Zord, which is badass. And eventually later on, there's actually a Dragon Promethean Dragon Thunder Zord that they have in there too, which is really, really cool. For the GM section of this chapter talks about Imperials and other cosmic scale enemies. Basically, it talks about how do you deal with effectively acts of God, things that the players don't defeat, they endure. And how do you deal with creatures so powerful like the Imperials, or like the Morphin Masters, if like a Morphin Master goes bad or something. These are characters that are so much more powerful than the player characters will ever be that it's simply impossible. These are effectively gods in Power Rangers. How do you deal with your Rangers having to deal with literal gods? Which again is a problem that a lot of GMs have, especially once you start getting into tier 3 and tier 4 content in games like Dungeons and Dragons, where your characters are supposed to be saving the world or saving the universe. How do you make this stuff believable? How do you give the players challenges without the challenges being, well, this is so powerful that you can never stop it, so why even bother? Or you are so powerful that there's nothing I can do to challenge you. That's what this little section here is for, and it's good advice. Then they have a section about allies effectively going bad. It's another thing that happens a lot more in the comics than it does in the TV show. The TV shows as a whole tend to be relatively light. And you will see bad guys become good guys. It's very rare for good guys to become bad guys without some kind of mind control. This section is called The Heel Turn, when allies, like, spoiler, go bad. And again, that's another thing that I think is not explored enough in storytelling in general. The idea of having a character that your players have a connection with, and just due to different philosophies and different choices that are made, eventually it causes that character to go, you know what? Screw this. I'm done working with you guys. I'm going to do this my way, and if you get in my way, I'm going to stop you. We do see that storyline show up in other forms of fiction relatively regularly. We just haven't really seen it too often in like Power Rangers or anything like that. And I think it makes a really, really good storyline for the players. Because first of all, they have a connection to the character already, so they already care about him. And the act of the betrayal can kind of do two different things to the players. One, it can kind of harden them to the point where they will want to defeat this character more than any other bad guy that you've dealt with because of the betrayal. Or two, they may want to find a way to redeem this character because they had a good relationship with them before. They're like, no, we can't just kill this guy off like we've done with all these other bad guys. We have to be able to save them. And because those two diametrically opposed ideas can actually exist in your player characters simultaneously, like you might have half the players going, no, we've got to save them, they're my friend, and the other half going, they betrayed us, they deserve to be defeated. So that in and of itself I find is really, really cool. And then they have a section about talking about the Morphin Masters in and of themselves. If you're not familiar with the Morphin Masters, it's something that originated in the comics that in Power Rangers Dino Fury, they started dealing with it. And then in Cosmic Fury, they were a major plot point for Cosmic Fury. But basically the Morphin Masters are the manifestation of the grid, which in the comic books I think they actually have an origin story for the Morphin Masters, but I can't remember off the top of my head. But again, they're the closest you're going to get to kind of deities in the Power Rangers universe. They are living embodiments of the grid, which is different than the emissaries, which is another thing that is exclusive to the comics, where they are kind of messengers and emissaries for the Morphin Masters. But the Morphin Masters in and of themselves are a step above. And again, a major plot point of Cosmic Fury is the Morphin Masters and kind of dealing with them in general. Again, without giving any spoilers away. And the final part of this chapter is more threats, and they're great. I think probably one of my favorite threats in this entire thing. There is a monster called Pandemonium. It is a panda. That is a monster. It's amazing. Everything about it is great. I love the name. Like, I'll just read the description. This monster is a monstrous panda with massive spikes on its back and bamboo armor that wants to create chaos and destroy everything around it. It's cool. I love it. And I love the fact that it's called Pandemonium. Everything about it is great. And then there's other stuff. They even have this really, really cool group. It's called Sentry Force 4. They originate in the comics. I'm not going to tell you anything about them because the storyline of the comic is really, really cool. But they're massively cool here. And they do show, think like Ginyu Force style enemies for the players to deal with. Or even, I guess, akin to the Psycho Rangers, where instead of having a single bad guy, you have a team of bad guys where when they're together, they're significantly more powerful, significantly more dangerous. And a lot of times the only way to deal with them is a divide and conquer style situation. I don't think the Sentry Force 4 are nearly as dangerous as the Psycho Rangers were, but they're super cool. And then they also have some Imperials here for you to deal with, which I love. Absolutely love. Because not only do they talk about the fact that, so Imperials in and of themselves, again, are forces of nature. You can't defeat them. But if you do certain things, you can weaken the Imperials. In the comics, there is a specific thing that happens that once that event happened, the Imperials were no longer these huge godlike beings. They were weakened and they were mortal, and you could actually kill them. So they talk about, this is how they weaken them in the comics. However, these are other ways that you can weaken them. And each Imperial is kind of has an opposite in the spectrum. So there are 3 Ranger emissaries. And the Ranger emissaries are the red emissary, the blue emissary, and the yellow emissary. And one of the reasons why those are the 3 emissaries is because those are the colors that show up, I believe, in every single Power Rangers team. There's always a red, a blue, and I think almost always a yellow. There might be 1 or 2 Power Rangers teams that didn't have a yellow, but there's always a red and there's always a blue. So each Imperial is a reflection of one of the emissaries. So the green Imperial is the opposite of the red emissary. The orange Imperial is the opposite of the blue emissary. The purple Imperial is the opposite of the yellow emissary. And one of the suggestions that they have is because they have an alternate color spectrum, it might be that the only way that you can weaken them, the only way that you can defeat them, is that the entire team has to use powers originating from that color spectrum. And they mentioned specifically the orange Imperial being weak against the blue emissary. So what if you had like a Forever Blue style episode where the only thing that could happen is you have to bring up Blue Rangers from around the grid, and each of your player characters could play a different Blue Ranger. Or, as happens in the comic, there's a situation where all the Power Rangers lose their access to the grid, but because Matt Cook has a different connection because his coin is technically partially synthetic, he gives all of the Power Rangers, he shares his Green Ranger power with all the Power Rangers, and so all the Power Rangers turn into Green Rangers. And it's a super cool It's a super cool part of the comic book, and it would make for a very, very cool little side story in your Power Rangers campaign. Of the only way you can deal with these is either all your Rangers have to go out and recruit as many Rangers as they can of the same spectrum to defeat these Imperials, or they all have to share that power. And however you decide to do that in the game, that's just a cool idea. And I think it's really, really fun, interesting. So, yeah. And then there's some other stuff. They even have a stat block for Matt Cook, the Promethean Green Ranger, if he ever comes to blows with the characters. Which the artwork for the Matt Cook Ranger, that looks custom to me. Again, I don't know if it is. Maybe I just missed the comic book where they had that, but it looks badass. So, yeah. And that's the end of that. Moving on. Chapter 4. Death and Darkness. This deals with the end of the Power Rangers run. And they specifically mentioned during the Charge to 100, Death Ranger, Recharge, and Darkest Hour arcs. That's what this one is dealing with. And one of the cool things about this is during those arcs, they... Again, the Power Rangers are moving forward, but they also go back to the beginning of the Morphin Grid and everything and talk about the Morphin Masters and the Morphin Master arches and stuff like that. So this whole chapter really gets into kind of the lore of the Power Rangers universe as a whole, which I really like. They have some new influence. They have one new influence called The Returned, which is basically you were dead and now you're not, so you can be an undead ranger. Some new contacts, which are super, super spoilery, so we're not going to go through them. And then new general perks and new grid powers. There's no new role or origins in this section. But they do introduce new gear. One of those pieces of gear is the Hyperforce Morpher. This is where they officially introduce the Hyperforce Rangers into there. They have a gorgeous piece of art of Peter's character. I can't remember his name now. The red Hyperforce Ranger that looks gorgeous. And they introduce a new weapon trait, Mythically Modular. Which is basically each one of the Hyperforce Rangers, their weapons were two weapons. Like the axe that the Black Ranger used was both an axe and a shield. Or the hammer that the Yellow Ranger used was both a hammer and a cannon. The bow that the Pink Ranger used was both a bow and a scythe. The trident for the Blue Ranger is both a trident and it could be turned into blades. The claws that the Red Ranger used are both claws and kind of handguns and stuff like that. It's really, really cool, really, really interesting, but it's definitely something that I think massively changes how you can play your characters because, weapons are a really, really important part of Essence 20 in general, and this basically allows you to kind of switch between two different weapons at the same time, which I love. And then they have the Hyperforce Swords. They have some new Zord features, which are great. And this is where they introduce the Dragon Thunder Zord. So it is a combination of the Red Dragon Thunder Zord, Griffin Thunder Zord, the Lion Thunder Zord, the Unicorn Thunder Zord, the Firebird Thunder Zord, and the Promethean Dragon Zord. It's Thunder Megazord and Dragon Zord together. It's the coolest thing ever! I love that. They have the Omega... the combined version of the Megazords, because I think the Omegazords show up somewhere else. And then they have the Hyperzords, which I love. They're super, super cool. Then for the GM section, because you're dealing with the Death Ranger and zombies and stuff like that, We have zombies and physical horror in Power Rangers. So that whole section, which again, very good. But I think this is my favorite section out of the whole book, is called What Happens If the Bad Guys Win. And this is something that a lot of GMs struggle with, because basically what happens if you have a TPK? Especially a TPK, if anyone's not familiar with the term TPK. TPK stands for Total Player Kill. It means all of your players are downed in a single combat. And a lot of people just go, well, campaign's over. And that's really boring. So this is basically describing what happens in a TPK. And how can you deal with that? Power Rangers has this happen a couple different times. If you look to Countdown to Destruction, which was the final, I think, 3 episodes of Power Rangers in Space, and it was supposed to be the finale of Power Rangers. Power Rangers was supposed to end after Power Rangers in Space, because Zeo was still relatively popular. Turbo was just not popular at all. And so by the time they got to Power Rangers in Space, they were thinking, yeah, this is going to be our last season. We're going to kind of just wrap up everything. It's one of the reasons why they destroyed Zordon in it, because Power Rangers was supposed to end. And so in Countdown to Destruction, the bad guys win. The Power Rangers lose their power for a little bit. Astronema takes over the Earth, enslaves everybody there. Like, it's a really, really bad time. And they're able to come back from it. And there's a few other times where the bad guys win. It happens a little bit more in Super Sentai than it does in Power Rangers. But every so often there'll be situations where it's like, well, the bad guys won this time. And like there were situations like when Zed destroyed the Dinozords and things like that. That was the bad guys won. It only lasted for a very short time, but it was the bad guys won. When Goldar destroyed the power coins, the bad guys won. So it's not that the idea that the bad guys winning never happens in Power Rangers, but it's not something that a lot of GMs are ready for. Because you want to challenge your players, you don't want to kill the players off. Because first of all, that means that the thing that the players have the strongest connection to, their characters, you may be getting rid of them. And that's not fun. And it can create, like I've seen TPKs break up game groups. Because certain people will be like, well, that wasn't fair. We shouldn't have died here or whatever, things like that. Like there's a lot of different things. So this what happens if the bad guys win gives you a bunch of different ways to deal with what happens if the bad guys win. And there's the same advice that I think I've given on this channel a few times. There's a bunch of different things you can do. One, player characters die, start a new group of adventurers in the same world and have them deal with the aftermath of what happens when the bad guys win. That's a totally fine thing. Another thing, your players' characters, instead of dying, can be captured. And now they have to break out and deal with a world where the bad guys won. One of the things that they introduce here is the idea of if they're defeated, they lose access to their morphing to the morphing grid, and so they still get to go, but they can't morph anymore, and so they have to fight kind of a guerrilla-style warfare against the bad guys to eventually find a way to regain their powers, which again is a thing that has happened in Power Rangers multiple times, and it's a really, really cool way. Then the final thing that they talk about is the players lose, the villains win, but then someone significantly more evil than the person that beat them shows up, and now they have to team up with the dude that just defeated them because they're both going to be defeated by the big dude. So, again, really, really good advice that is useful outside the Power Rangers RPG and very, very handy for GMs in general. And then we go to the threat section. This is much more zombie themed because we're dealing with the Death Ranger and everything like that. But a lot of really cool, a lot of really, really good stuff in here. that again I'm not going to spoil because there's some really really good stuff in here that if you haven't read them, I don't want to ruin major plot points in the comics. So yeah, moving on. Chapter 5, Coinless Campaign. So they have an adventure in here, and the adventure is effectively your rangers get sent to the world of the Coinless, and they have to deal with the resurgence of Lord Drakon. Lord Drakon shows up with a new flavor of Ranger sentries that are different from the Ranger sentries that already exist, and the kind of government that Lord Drakon left when he was kind of exiled from this world. Like, that still exists. They're called the Loyalists, and the Coinless Resistance still exists, and now there is a third group that is led by this kind of reborn Drakon and his new Ranger sentries. And so the adventure itself is your Rangers show up in this world and they have to figure out how to deal with this. The adventure itself is interesting. However, there are some small issues with it. Probably the biggest issue that I have when you start playing the game or doing the adventure, it starts with your characters being transported to the world of the Coinless and instantly being attacked by some Ranger sentries. And these are these new Ranger sentries. Partway through the fight, slight spoiler for the first kind of encounter of this campaign. Partway through the fight, a Tyrannosaurus sentry comes in a ship and brings a bunch more sentries. And the Tyrannosaurus sentry helps the Coinless and the player characters fight off these new sentries. Which kind of blows everybody away because the Ranger sentries have always been the bad guys and the Coinless have always been the good guys. And now the Ranger sentries are helping you. This doesn't make sense. So what eventually happens is you get to meet representative of two different factions. You have the Loyalist, or let's start with the Coinless. The first person you meet when you land there is this dude who calls himself Bulk. Anyone that's watched Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, Bulk was one of the bullies. And eventually throughout that, he goes from being a bully to eventually joining the police force to eventually becoming a detective. And eventually he gets to go to the Lost Galaxy. But one of my favorite things about Bulk is while he was a bully when he was first introduced, during Countdown to Destruction, Astronema comes out and she's addressing the people of Angel Grove. She goes, "People, I have decided I am going to destroy this city unless the Power Rangers surrender themselves to me right now, because the Power Rangers are in hiding. Power Rangers, if you don't come out right now, I'm going to kill everybody here." Really dark thing for a kids' television series. And as the Power Rangers are about to turn them over to Astronema, you hear somebody yell out, "Hey!" And out walks Bulk and he goes, "I am the Blue Ranger." And everyone just looks kind of weird. It's like, what the? And then Professor something comes over and goes, "Yes, and I am the Red Ranger." And another person comes out and, "I'm the Yellow Ranger." Another one, "And I'm the Pink Ranger." And "I'm the Black Ranger." And all of these people who are not Power Rangers basically start standing up and going, "No, the Power Rangers need us." And so they have this very I am Spartacus moment. And then the Power Rangers actually show up. They morph and they start fighting the Quantrons. And as the Power Rangers are fighting these overwhelming odds, Bulk turns to all the civilians who have no power whatsoever and he goes, "Guys, the Power Rangers need us. Let's go!" And so Bulk goes from this bully who is just there for comic relief and to be like a minor antagonist to the players, to the person that rallies humans, like just rallies all the civilians to help the Power Rangers in their time of need, and actually steps up because he didn't know the Power Rangers were going to show up. He basically stepped up to sacrifice himself for the Rangers. That's super, super cool. So Bulk is one of the first characters you meet in the world of Coinless, and he belongs to the Coinless Resistance. After all the Ranger sentries go, one Ranger sentry stays back. And as soon as they're all gone, he takes his helmet off. And I'm going to read the box text to you because it's a really, really brilliant, beautiful way to introduce this particular character. So just before the box text, once they've gone and it's just the Rangers with Bulk and someone else left, he takes off his helmet with a wry grin. Bulk, why is it always trouble with you? He salutes the Rangers with a hand to his chest. Eugene Skulovich, Tyrannosaurus Sentry, but my friends call me Skull. And we're going to need your friendship to deal with these new sentries. So, you actually get to see Bulk and Skull, and they're both leaders of their respective factions, or high-ups in their respective faction. They're not the leaders outright. But in the comic books, Skull has actually been a Ranger Sentry, and he's been a mole for the Coinless. Like he wasn't like a Ranger Sentry that they turned or something. Like he joined the Sentries to be a mole for the Coinless. And then Bulk has been working with the Coinless for the entire comic run. And this is where I think the writing gets real bad, because the interesting thing about this adventure is you get to choose which side you want to join with to fight against this new Drakon. If and this is where the problem comes in, because they don't actually give you a reason to choose one over the other in this section. If you read on later on, what you basically find out is if you join the Loyalists with Skull, you have access to more shit. Like, that's really what it is you just get access to a heck ton of more stuff. Whereas if you join the Coinless with Bulk, you get to work with people like Zack, the original Black Ranger, and they're much more kind of guerrilla warfare, secret infiltration type stuff, whereas the Loyalists are much more kind of upfront in your face style stuff. So do you want to join, effectively, do you want to join the Paladins or the Rogues is what it is. None of that is really explained here. The information that they give you here is really, really limited. It's a single paragraph, and then they have a table of Q&A responses. So if you ask, what made the world this way? You have a response from Bulk. Who's in charge, or where's Lord Drakon? You have a single response. They don't really give you anything here that would allow the players to make a choice as to who they wanted to join. They simply go, well, who do you want to join? And because anyone familiar with the comics or just talking and learning the stuff they do here, you're basically asked, do you want to help the bad guys or do you want to help the good guys? And it's going to, in a Power Rangers game, it's not going to be a choice. It's going to be, well, I'm always going to help the good guys. I'm never going to help the bad guys. Despite the fact that one of the bad guys is a good guy, they don't give you any reason why you would ever want to join the Loyalists. And then going further, as soon as you side with the Coinless, they have an interaction where effectively Skull goes, okay, I get it. And then he has to kind of cover it up, and so he has Bulk do some stuff to make it look like he was overpowered. If you side with the Loyalists, you side with Skull, Bulk... I'm going to just read this because it kind of gives me the same feeling that I got when I was doing Dragon Age the Veilguard, and they give you a similar choice. We get to choose one city over another city, and if you choose one, the other character goes, hey, I understood. You had to make a hard choice, and that was the choice that you made. I get it. And if you choose the other one, he goes, how could you? You're an evil person. You abandoned all these people to death and destruction. You're a horrible, disgusting person. And that's effectively what happens here. This is the actual text. Bulk looks saddened by your choice, then shakes his head as he notes that he should get used to not needing rangers to save the day. Like, that's such a slap to the face of, yeah, I guess Power Rangers really aren't that useful. It's such an incredibly, like, it makes it to where there's a right choice and a wrong choice. And that's not how tabletop RPGs should work. If you're giving your players choices, any choices that you give your players has to be the right choice for them. Can there be consequences of choices? Yes. But if you're going to punish them without giving them a reason why they're going to be punished, like if your players are they defeat a bad guy to find out there's a worse guy, and the lich that they've just killed is going, well, there's a god of death that's coming, I'm trying to kill him. And they have the choice between destroy the lich's phylactery and get rid of him, or let the lich join you so that you have extra power. There are some, like, it should be fairly easy for them to realize that, oh, this is a lich and he's betrayed us before. There's a good chance he's going to betray him. They don't give you any of that information in here. It's such a limited amount of information that the only thing that you have is side with the good guys or side with the bad guys. And if the players go, this seems like a really, really obvious choice, I'm going to side with the quote unquote bad guys because obviously there has to be something more here. You're going to punish them by telling them, well, you made the wrong choice, and now I'm going to make sure that you understand by insulting your honor. That's not cool. I think this particular section should be larger, which again, understand, putting more pages in a book, significantly more difficult than I make it sound, but there's just not enough here to allow the players to make a choice here. You're not really giving them their choice, you're giving them the illusion of choice. And then you're reinforcing that illusion of choice by, if they make the quote-unquote wrong choice, then you're going to punish them by insulting their honor. Nothing about this is fun, nothing about this is cool. The rest of the adventure is actually really interesting. And it's split up to, if you choose the Loyalist, you get this. If you choose the Coinless, you get this. That is really cool. And it means replaying this adventure is something that could be a lot of fun for a lot of players. But they don't give you enough of a reason to choose the Loyalists here, other than, hey, Skull's a cool guy. That's it. There needs to be more here. There needs to be, have an argument between Bulk and Skull, where, Bulk goes, Skull, we had you join them to help the Coinless, and now you've drank the Kool-Aid. How can you think that this new leader is going to be any different than Lord Drakon was? And then having Skull retort back, because this is a theme that you see in there. Listen, the Coinless provided a good service. You were able to overthrow Drakon, but the Coinless are disorganized and they are sowers of chaos. What the world needs now is some structure, and we can do that. All you guys can do is disassemble things, which was great when the world needs disassembling, but now the world needs building, and you guys just aren't doing that. That would give you an actual choice. He's like, you have these people that their goal is to rebuild the world, but they're working with some bad people to do it, or these people who are much more about kind of rebellion and fighting against tyranny, but they are the good guys. They're not sacrificing their morals to be able to, do what's best for the greater good or anything like that. So you kind of get that choice between, stick to your morals or the ends justify the means. That is a decision that the players can actually think about. They can discuss amongst themselves. And then instead of having this, Bulk looks saddened by your choice, then shakes his head as he notes that he should get used to not needing rangers to save the day. Just pure slap in the face. Bolt goes, fine. You know what? I get it. You make the decision that you want. We're still going to try and stop this. Without this huge point of, I guess Ranger, you can't rely on Power Rangers anymore. Instead of doing that, just go, you know what? Fine. That's your choice. Skull. It's been great. Flashbang. Run away. There are better ways to do this without kind of slapping the players in the face. The rest of the adventure is really cool. I like it. It introduces a lot of cool stuff. It starts, I believe, everybody starts at level 9 for this. Is that what it is? And eventually gets on to level like 11 or 12, something like that. Anyway, it's a mid-level campaign compared to most of the other adventures that I've seen have been for relatively low-level characters, like between like level 4 and 6 or 8. This is a higher level campaign. It's super cool. The stuff that they introduce is crazy awesome and fun. They introduce a new Ranger Sentry in the Silver Ranger Sentries, which is just badass and cool. Like, it's just amazing. They introduce some new villains that are alternate versions of villains that the Power Rangers had to deal with in the Prime reality, and how Lord Drakkon taking over the world kind of changed things, which is really cool. And they actually deal with some stuff that is dealt with significantly further on in the Power Rangers mythos that I'm not going to spoil. Another thing that I really like, during the 4th part, there's kind of like a group, like a mass combat kind of thing, and they can spend story points to do special things, like call artillery from your Zords to come down and help attack, or get cover fire from your allies. It's a really cool mechanic that makes the battle seem significantly more epic, which I really love. And then, you get to deal with that. You have 2 different endings depending on whether you chose the Loyalist or whether you chose the Coinless, which, again, my first reading of this, the way it's presented, the vast majority of players are going to choose the Coinless, because it's a choice between, hey, do you want to be the bad guys or the good guys? Which kind of sucks. Because, again, the rest of the adventure is interesting and fun with both sides. But it's that initial choice that's just, they don't give you enough for the players to make a good choice there. And then the other thing that I really love about this is they have a section after the epilogue, what most people call epilogue, but it's more fun to call it epilogue, and watch all of the English majors and writing majors' heads explode. So after the epilogue, they have a thing where there's a character that's introduced. They're like, hey, if you didn't deal with this character, there's a good chance that you might have to deal with them later on in your campaign. Then they also mention, by the way, this is the end of the adventure. What else do you want to do? Like, this adventure, you solved this problem, but this problem is a symptom of a significantly larger issue. So what are you going to do about that larger issue, and how is it going to affect your campaign going forward? Yeah. That's the end of the adventure, so moving on to final thoughts. Overall, I love this book. I think it's a fantastic book. The 2 new roles I think are interesting, though I think I like the Magna Defender a little bit more than I like the Guardian of Eltar. The new threats are really great. The new contexts are really good. The amount of lore in here is staggering, and the artwork is just so gorgeous and amazing. But like I said, I think the thing that I enjoy the most about this entire book is the For the GM sections, because there's so much good information there for GMs. There's good stuff for everybody in this book, but those For the GM sections are just brilliant. They're very well written. And then the little mini campaign that they have in here is great to a point. The introduction does not land super well. The rest of it flows very, very well, but they need to beef up that choice point because they give you so little information to go off to make that choice that the players and the choice itself is not presented equally. Despite the fact that both sides help you, one side is already associated with the bad guy and one side is already associated with the good guy. So unless you come up with a reason to show why the bad guys aren't bad anymore, it's not a choice. It's, do you want to be the bad guys in this or do you want to be the good guys? And because you are Power Rangers, you are always going to choose the good guys. So that's my only issue with the campaign is if they would beef that up. And if I were to run this campaign, I would put a much larger emphasis. Bulk and Skull, when Skull reveals himself and they start kind of talking to each other, they would have a significantly longer interaction before dealing with the Rangers. And then when they both make their case of, hey, you should join us, they would argue with each other a little bit more. Because I think that makes a more compelling choice. And the choice that they have in there isn't really a choice. And the rest of the campaign is super cool and interesting. But because they kind of flop on this one choice, it kind of taints the rest of the campaign. Like I said, it's not that it's a bad campaign, but if you want your players to have a good choice, you are going to have to write something and give them a reason to make that choice. Because the adventure itself doesn't. And you're going to have to ignore that little part where Bulk basically slaps the players in the face if they choose the loyalists. Because the same thing doesn't happen with Skull. Skull just goes, hey, that's your choice. I understand what you made. Bulk, make it look good. So, yeah. Like, again, the just massive dichotomy of there's a right choice and a wrong choice. And not only if you choose the wrong choice are you going to know it, you are instantly going to be punished for it. That's not okay. Other than that, it's a really cool adventure, and I like it. So yeah, overall, cool adventure. But that's going to be all for me today. As always, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon to turn notifications on. All those things are super important. In the comments down below. First of all, do you have a favorite arc that shows up here? Are you a big fan of Shattered Grid? Do you like the Worlds Beyond stuff? Do you like the Death Ranger stuff? Let me know in the comments down below. And are you a loyalist? Are you a coinless? You are given the choice now. Are you going to join the loyalist or are you going to join the coinless in the coinless campaign? Let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, again, it's all for me today, and I will see you guys next time. All right? Bye-bye.